All right. Are you ready?
I am.
All right. Well, hello. It's I guess it's the first Tuesday of December. So every first Tuesday of every month we have the Fishers History Chat. And tonight I'm excited to have Robert Bowling, who is one of my board members with me on the Fishers Historical Society, and he's also a published author. He's written two books that I know of. One is Wicked Fishers, and another one is Hoosier Vigilantes, which we're going to talk about tonight. Uh, Now, on a less exciting note, I just think I want to basically pass on word today that a friend of ours who's been a longtime board member just passed over the weekend, Mark Rouse. And if you have not seen Mark's artwork, then go on Facebook and look for art by Mark Rouse, and you might want to get some of that because he was a very gifted artist, and like Robert and I said, we have no idea what happened. It just was totally out of the blue. I was just talking to him on Saturday. So um in any case, but now let's get back to Hoosier vigilantism, which is a little bit more fun topic to talk about. And so Robert, I want you to introduce yourself. Tell us what you do and how you got into this mess, and then we'll find out what kind of trouble you were going to tell us about.
So Robert Bowling. So I am I guess, the historian for the Officials Historical Society. And a few years back, I started writing some history articles about the city of Fishers for the Current, and that eventually led to me writing the book Wicked Fishers. It wasn't something that I thought about, but a publishing company saw some of the work that I had done for Current, and they reached out and said, "Would you be interested in writing a book?" So I did, and I wrote Wicked Fishers. And then after Wicked Fishers, I actually worked with a few other authors and historians to write a book for our for Hamilton County's 200th anniversary. So that book is it's called 200 Years of Change, and it has history about all the different townships in Hamilton County. So it was a really cool project. Got to work with David Highway, who's our county historian, some people from Sheridan and Carmel Clay. So it's brought a bunch of historians together, and then we wrote this book.
When
Um,
did that come out?
so that book came out in 2023. That was
Okay.
our 200th anniversary. So we wrote a book for that. And then I wanted to write another book, and but this time, what I've noticed about Wicked Fishers is, unless you're from Fishers, it's probably not going to be interesting. The audience is going to be very small. Some people have tried to read it that are like friends of mine, and you know, but they don't, unless you live here, you don't really understand what's going on in the book. So that's when I decided I wanted to write a book that's a little bit more statewide, and that's when I kind of came up with the idea of Hoosier Vigilantes, and then that's kind of how we got to today.
So we have some vigilantes that have been around here in the Hoosier land for a while, huh?
Yes, they've been around. We've had vigilantism since our country was founded, and we still have vigilantism today. Just may not be in the same form that it was back then. But we've always had vigilantism, and it's because if you think about it, back when our country was founded, you didn't really have law enforcement. You may have had this lone marshal on the frontier, um, but for the most part, the citizens had to take care of themselves. You couldn't depend that somebody was going to save you. So vigilante was born from that. And once we got law enforcement and it became professionalized, which wasn't really until the early 1900s that it became like a professionalized force. Before then, law enforcement was just it was like a political patronage thing. You know, I'm a Democratic mayor, a Republican mayor. I give you a job because you supported me in the election, but most of the officers couldn't even read or write. So once law enforcement became professionalized, then they started vigilantism and law enforcement kind of butted heads with each other, and and then we had this power struggle where, all right, well, who's in the right? Law enforcement is here to enforce the law, but then you still have people that believe in that type of vigilante justice that sometimes I may have to take the law into my own hands.
Well, I think of your Wicked Fishers and the story about the resurrectionist doctor in Fishers. That he kind of got a little vigilante against him too, if I'm not mistaken. Or the town basically tried to run him out of town.
Yeah, he was not very well liked after that. And when he did come back to town, I mean, yeah, he there was an incident where they hid behind cars and then they egged him. Basically, didn't want him to come back and come back to town. But
Yeah, if you guys don't know what resurrectionists is, they're grave robbers. So sell the cadavers to medical hospitals, or if they did back in that day. So tell me what some of the things you learned in researching this book and finding the stuff for the vigilanteism here.
well, the way that I even got started writing this book in the first place was a couple of things came together. One, when I was writing about Wicked Fishers, there's a chapter about the Whitecaps, and that was kind of interesting to me when I was writing that chapter because I didn't know anything about the Whitecaps, and so I went down a little bit of a rabbit hole with that. But then with my background in law enforcement, and when I retired in 2020, um, there I wanted to understand when vigilantism kind of started, and then kind of the birth of law enforcement. Like when did my profession really take hold? And then I realized that there's actually an intersection between these two. You can't you can't have one without the other. And we actually law enforcement we depend on people that would, I guess, in a way, can consider themselves vigilantes. We depend on them because law enforcement can't be everywhere at the same time, at every place. So we need we need people to be the eyes and ears and help us. But there's also that line where we're the law enforcement, you help us, but we can't have you crossing that line, right? Um, and so, but I realized that also when it comes to vigilantism, there's good vigilantes and then there's bad vigilantes. But it's up to you as the reader to determine from your own sense of morality what you consider to be good and what you consider to be bad. So when I wrote this book, I wrote about these groups, but it's up to you as the reader to determine how you view vigilantism. And usually, and I give a presentation not too long ago to a group, and I always started off with, do you view vigilantism as positive or negative? Like, if you hear that word, is it positive to you or negative? Because that's going to shape kind of how you read this book and how you view these groups. But you're going to find out that some of these groups in this book are actually very noble. They did really good things, and that's one thing I learned about after writing um, this book.
Well, it's probably, I mean, probably as old as humankind, where they did step up and take care of things that were going on in their cities and their towns or whatever. I just finished a book, and I suppose you could call it vigilantism. It was in the King Philip's Wars back in 1676, whatever it was, um, where the book I just finished was by Mary Rowlandson, and she wrote her experiences. She basically everybody in her village was killed, and she and her children were taken and sold as slaves into the Native American troops that were part of King Philip's tribes,
Mm-hmm.
and tells about her stories in there. And then the vigilantes, I guess you would say, or it's the English soldiers that were from these different villages coming back and trying to get people. So I guess technically they called themselves soldiers, but they were just they were the butcher over here, and they grabbed their muskets and took off.
Yeah. Well, it's funny that there's a lot of vigilante groups out there that you probably don't think of them as a vigilante group. But if you actually look at the definition of okay, let me talk about the definition here. Because this is one thing when I was writing this book, my introduction to this book is actually a very important chapter. Because you can look in Merriam-Webster and you can look up the definition of a vigilante, and it'll give you the definition. It says basically it's someone who takes the law in their own hands. But the problem is that political scientists, scholars, nobody can really um, come up with a definition for vigilantism because it all depends on how you view it. If it's positive or negative to you. So you've got some people on one side who, when they try to give a definition for vigilantism, it's in a negative connotation. But you've got another group who view vigilantism as positive and that it's part of the normal order of society. They have a more positive or view of it. So
Well,
that's
technically, wouldn't the Minutemen in Massachusetts be considered that?
I would say yes, I would. I
Yeah.
would definitely say that they were. And then even when you had like these little towns and villages, they would
Hmm.
have people in the town. You would take turns and watch over everybody while they slept. And so if you think about that, when I was talking to this group a few months ago, I asked them, "Is anybody in here, and anybody that's listening or will be listening, are you a member of a neighborhood watch group?" And some people, one person said they were a part of it, and I said, "Or do you know anybody that's in the neighborhood watch?" All right, and if you go into some of these neighborhoods, you'll see that little sign. It's a national organization, but if you think about it, they're vigilantes. If you look at what they do, it's a group of people, a group of citizens who are formed to suppress violence. So what are you doing as a neighborhood watch? If you're like the block captain, you know, you do your walks around the neighborhood, you're looking for crime. It doesn't mean that you're actually going to have to intervene, but you're going to call the police, hopefully, and the police will get involved. In a way, to me, that is a vigilante. You are protecting your community because you know that the police can't be there. Most neighborhoods can't have a police officer in their
And never.
neighborhood 24/7.
Right.
So because there's a lack of law enforcement, like they can't be everywhere, you as the citizen, you've got to take some responsibility to protect yourself. It's just how far are you going to take it? That's where vigilantism can go from positive to negative. Some people will cross that line, such as like the famous case was down in Florida with Zimmerman. Um, he was a neighborhood watch and ended up killing. I think his name was Trayvon Martin. But there's some of those instances right there. But most people in neighborhood watch groups, it's been around since the 70s.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm sorry, I think been around since the 60s.
Probably been around since the 1600s or the 1500s. I mean, technically,
Oh
you
yeah,
have
yeah,
people
yeah.
that, so,
But the
called
actual
as a neighborhood
yeah,
watch
yes.
group. Yeah.
But yeah, we've always had neighborhood watches. You've always had to have people protecting you because and way back then there was no law enforcement. Um, and what you had a sheriff, which is the oldest law enforcement officer coming that we brought that from England. But even then, the sheriff back then didn't have the ability to cross county lines, and they were very like, and you really didn't have deputies, so you had one man patrolling a huge area of land.
Yeah, like a 20 mile by 20 mile square or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, so
On a horse.
yeah, on horse. Yes.
Mhm.
So just imagine, trying to like respond to a call or something. It's going to take you a while. So
Well, I mean, technically, anyone that's ever kind of considered themselves a sheepdog, what I mean, where you step in when somebody's in trouble and put yourself between the trouble and them, which God, I've done dozens of times,
yeah,
sometimes more involved than others. But technically, isn't that the same thing?
yes, yes, I would say so.
Hmm.
And
So,
and that's one thing. So when I started writing this book, I actually had to ask myself, does this group meet the definition of a vigilante? And so what I did was I basically researched all these different types of groups, and if I felt like it met the criteria, where it was a group of civilians who came together to suppress law and order, to fight crime, then I included them in the book. Some people may disagree with some of the groups, but it's all about what your definition is. And I think that's the interesting part about this is before you read the book, you have to ask yourself, what do you think a vigilante is? And then how do you view a vigilante? And then I think after you can ask yourself that, because I don't think a lot of people really have taken the time to think about, like most people will probably say a vigilante is bad. Whenever I have them raise their hand, majority of the room will say a vigilante is bad. But after you read the book, you're going to read that there's a bunch of groups that they were good, and they had a very noble purpose. Some of them were actually sanctioned by the government.
Well, let's like I'm thinking about what is now I can't think of his name, the 10 Point Coalition downtown,
Yeah.
where they try to intervene, they try to get them stop the crime and things like that. Technically, it's a church-based group, it's a faith-based group, but they stand in front of trouble.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, you could definitely say that they could be in a way a vigilante group if you say that they're a group of citizens that band together.
I mean,
Um,
not saying it's a bad group. I'm saying, but technically, they're standing in the breach.
yes. Which, yeah, once again, not like I said, not all vigilantes is bad. They're doing something very noble,
Mhm.
and they're doing what they can, um, and that's why I feel like with law enforcement, we need groups like that, that work with law enforcement. But you do have some groups that are not going to work with law enforcement. They're going to take the law into their own hands, and that is where we can say yes, this group is bad, this group is good. They're they're working with us. Um, so like case in point, I'll go ahead and talk about this one. One of the um, one of the last chapters of the book is the future of vigilantism. There's a group that is on Facebook. It's called um, Sexual Predator Hunters of Indianapolis. There's actually a group in Muncie. I reached out to the group. Nobody ever contacted me back. Um, but what this group does is they go online and they pose as underage kids trying to catch basically pedophiles. Um, and although I commend their efforts, because they said the reason why they do this is that they believe that law enforcement is too overworked, and they're doing their part to rid our society of these type of individuals, and they want to catch them. I have no problem with that part. The part that I have an issue with, though, is there was one incident down in Avon where they met, they were talking to somebody online, and they said, let's meet in Avon. So the person shows up in Avon thinking that they're going to meet I guess, an underage child. They're there, with Facebook Live ready to catch them, right? And then you see the person, they'll cover their face and then they'll try to walk away. The problem with that is if something happened, they're not a law enforcement officer. So if that guy or whoever came to meet them, if they feel threatened or if he feels threatened, he can defend himself. And they don't really have a leg to stand on because they're not a law enforcement officer. They don't have the power to arrest. Um, so I understand why they're doing what they're doing, and in a way, I commend them. However, what they should be doing is if they do get information like that, then they need to call law enforcement and say, hey, look, I've been talking to this person. They think that I'm a child. I'm going to give you this information. We have these task force. Let them handle it. They're the law enforcement officer. You're not.
There in there another problem with that too is because I've heard different ones that are doing these child predator catches where if they don't do everything right, they're giving the guy a case to get off on
Yes,
technicalities.
yes. When I was writing the book, and I was researching the group, there was a lot of prosecutors in the Indianapolis area that were saying these are vigilantes. They actually use that word. And they're saying that you are, in a way, you're a police officer by proxy. And as police officers, we have to you have certain rights so that we don't encroach on those. Like you have the right, we have to get search warrants for things. Civilians don't have to do that. But if you're acting as if you're a police officer, then the courts could look at that and say, well, you got this information illegally, and it's the fruit of the poisonous tree. And then if we try to build a case against this person, it could all fall apart because the defense is like, you've got this information illegally. That that's where it's really hard for me because I understand why they're doing what they're doing, and I commend any group that wants to get these type of people off the streets. But then I wonder you're not doing it the right way,
Yeah.
and you actually put yourself in a position where you now could be arrested if you try to, let's say he tries to walk away and you put your hand on him to stop him. That actually right there, that's a battery by putting your hand on him to stop him. You actually open yourself up to a lot of like liability and a lot
And
of
you don't have the protection that police officers have.
no.
Yeah. That's kind of like, I have another uh, thing. I have an organization called Life's Co-Pilot. It basically works for seniors, and we try to bring experts in to talk about it. So we do a lot of the same stuff we're doing right here on YouTube and on what have you on these videos. And I had a gentleman on who was talking about cybercrime and some of the things that were going on. And he's a Homeland Security officer in here in Indianapolis, and he was talking about a group or different groups called they do glitter bombs. I don't know if you're familiar with this or
Yeah,
not.
yeah. Yep.
And it's really hilarious to watch, but they catch these
The
guys that
porch
are,
pirates.
huh? Yeah,
The
porch
porch
pirates,
pirates. Yeah.
but they're doing it for people that are also there to pick up like money or to pick up drugs or to pick up. They will, because these groups will send these things to. A lot of times they'll send them to a Airbnb, to the address of the Airbnb owner,
Hmm.
and then they have somebody waiting. As soon as that's delivered with UPS, they go pick it up. And so they will do things to switch things up on people or whatever, and do this, which is pretty dangerous when you got somebody that's going to pick up $50,000 cash and you give them a glitter
Yeah.
bomb. But
Yeah.
but anyway, because they might drown on that. So, but that would also fall into that vigilante kind of justice, I suppose, too.
Yep.
So without just giving everybody away your stuff, what kind of things did you find from vigilantes here in Indiana? I mean, as far as some of the topics that maybe not where it went, but just some of the different things that people were doing.
Well, well, I'll just kind of start off with some of like what I would say some of the bad ones, and then I'll talk about some of the good groups that I came
Mm-hmm.
across. But obviously, way back in when the state was founded, like I said, back still wasn't a lot of law enforcement, and a lot of the vigilante groups were Southern Indiana. A lot of the groups I'm about to talk about, we're talking about like Seymour, um, Brown County, Orange County. And it's because that area of the state, it was there was no roads, and it was very hard to. A lot of rolling hills. If you ever started heading like toward Evansville,
Well,
um,
the glacier didn't get that far. Just north of Martinsville, everything changes.
yeah. So it was very hard to even traverse that type of terrain back then. But one of the first groups I came across was they were called vigilante committees. That's what they called themselves. And the most famous one was out in California in San Francisco. But we had one here in Indiana, and it started off in Seymour. And there was a group called the Reno Gang, and they're very well known here in Indiana. They were a group of brothers who basically terrorized everybody in town. And some people just finally just got fed up with it. They got fed up with these brothers robbing everybody, and they formed a vigilance committee. And their main job was we're going to go after the Reno brothers, and we're going to rid our community of these people. Um, but the Reno brothers, they carried out the first train robbery. So, and back then, I don't have my book with or my notes with me at the moment, but It was the amount of money they stole was upwards in the, I don't know, millions of dollars. Today it would have been. So eventually, the gang was eventually captured, and there was like five people. Two of them were arrested first, and as they were being taken to the jail, this vigilance committee stopped the sheriffs that were taking them to the jail, and they hung them right there next to a tree. A couple of days later, two more were being transported to jail. They were captured by the vigilance committee and hung right on the same tree. Today, it's an unincorporated community, but it's called Hangman's Crossing, and I mean, it's just like a. I'm guessing that's where the tree used to be. I went
Yeah.
down there, but really couldn't find anything. But then, so now you've had four people that were basically lynched by this vigilance committee. The two other brothers, they fled up to Canada. They were in Windsor, and so when they were arrested, it's like an international incident. Canada did not want to give us those two brothers back because they said, obviously, you can't protect them. You already arrested four members of their gang and they were lynched. How can you guarantee their safety? So they said, this is what we'll do. We will guarantee their safety. And instead of taking them to the jail in Seymour, they're going to take them all the way down to New Albany in Jefferson County. Or no, that's
Yeah,
Jefferson.
it's down there, right there on the river.
Yeah. So they're going to take them to New Albany. And lo and behold, somehow the people of Seymour found out where they were being held, and they got on a train that night, went to New Albany, um, grabbed the sheriff and his wife out of bed, tied them up, didn't hurt them, and then went to the jail, got the two brothers, and they hung them right there in the jail cell. Um, Now, if you look at some of the newspaper articles back then, a lot of newspapers, some of them commended the Vigilance Committee for what they did. And then you have another group that says that what you did was unlawful, that the rest of the country is going to look at Indiana as a bunch of lawless people, and we're going to have blood on our hands. So even back then, you had people who commended them, commended what they did, and then you had another group that said what you did was wrong. You need to let the courts handle it. But that was the other problem back then. Not only did we didn't have any law enforcement, the court system was also very corrupt.
Hmm.
Judges were easily paid off, and a lot of people felt like you couldn't trust the courts. You weren't going to get the justice that you were looking for. And so that's why these groups were very popular. They had a lot of traction, and they just kept on growing. Um, but another group was the Whitecaps that I had mentioned earlier, and that's when I was writing my book, Wicked Fishers, where I first came across this group. And this is a group where they were similar to the KKK. However, they were not motivated by race. This group went after people in the community who were either lazy people, drunkards, people that beat their wives, um, anybody that was basically a detriment to society. You didn't do your part. And if you were marked, they would leave a bag of switches on your front porch. And you basically had a note that went along with it that said, either straighten up, get out of town, and if you don't do any of those, then you're going to get beaten. And that's exactly what would happen. They would come back and they would basically beat you. They didn't really kill a lot of people, but they exacted their own sense of justice. And I like to think of them as like almost like a morality police.
Yeah,
I
kind of
mean,
like Boondocks. What is it? Boondock Saints.
yeah,
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 the
yeah. It's like,
movie.
yeah, it's like a sense of morality.
Yeah.
That's who they went after. Now they didn't really come up north a lot, so they mainly operated in southern Indiana. But there was a time I can't remember. I think it was back in the 20s or 30s is when they're the last kind of whitecap activity that we had. But it got so bad at one point in the late 1800s that the governor threatened to move Indiana University from Bloomington to another part of the state unless they got control of the Whitecap activity. I thought that was interesting.
That's pretty big.
Because there could have been a chance that Indiana University could be in another city in Indiana, but the governor had to threaten that if you do not get control of these Whitecaps, and they were, it was like the KKK, they wore masks.
Yeah.
Um, Nobody knew who they were, but everybody knew that it was very prominent people in the community, and they would get together and they would go out and they would go after people that you weren't pulling your weight.
You had not lived up to their moral code.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, so what are the kind of things that you find? Those are still kind of, are they good guys or bad guys? So just
No,
depends on
that's
which side of the
yeah.
fence you're sitting on.
But then as we start getting into like the 1900s, one of the first groups that I came across that was very, I guess, in my opinion, very noble was the Horse Thief Detective Association. So just like their name implies, horse thief was a big problem back then. And
Hmm.
some people laugh when I say this group. I mean, this group had badges, they had bylaws. I mean, it was an organization, and it actually started in the town of Wingate, Indiana. There is
I've actually heard of it, but I don't know where it is.
yeah, there's a monument dedicated to the first horse thief detective company that went after a group called the Redwood Gang, and they basically stole horses. And I tell people, if you think about it, back then, stealing someone's horse was like stealing someone's car today.
Right.
I mean, people depended on their horse to travel, depended on for their livelihood, to make money for the crops. So yeah, stealing someone's horse was a big deal. And I thought it was crazy that these people that could steal a horse had all these little tricks to disguise it. Like the first thing they would do was change the shoes on the horse, dye the mane or cut the mane off. It's almost like a chop shop for horses,
Hmm.
right? And but this is what this group did. All this group did was they went after horse thieves and try to bring them to justice. But this group was actually sanctioned by the Indiana state legislature. So this is a group, they were just private citizens, and the state recognized that we had a lack of law enforcement, we had a big problem with horse thieves, and we needed people in the community that was willing to stand up. So they actually gave them police powers. They weren't police officers, but they were given the power of arrest. And to me, that was a very interesting because now here's a group before the White Caps and you got the vigilance committees. Most people, would say bad, right? This group, very noble, given powers by the government, and they could do things that even the sheriff couldn't do. A sheriff back then couldn't cross county lines. So once the criminal got to the next county, sheriff was like, nothing I can do. Sorry. But
Well, that was that way for years because when I was young, they couldn't cross county lines.
yeah,
So then they had the brilliant idea they could just deputize people. They could go,
yeah,
across. But for a long time, if you got to the county line, they stopped.
yeah. And then even back then, you didn't have a lot of deputies because one of the things that if a sheriff wanted to have a deputy, the pay for the deputy came out of the sheriff's pay. So of course, I don't want to lose money, so I'm going to, we're not going to really have any deputies. It's just going to be me. But I found an incident where there was a horse stolen from Fishers, and a group for that was the Fishers chapter. They found this horse in Dayton, Ohio. Just think about that. I mean, on horseback, how long it takes you to get to Dayton in a car. This group tracked this horse down in Dayton and was able to bring that horse back to Fishers to the rightful owner. I mean, that's a lot of work.
That's a lot of work. I
Yeah.
mean, I had now this is off the subject, but I just had this kind of an impact moment. I drove a couple weeks ago. I went down to meet my granddaughter and a new one in Dallas. And on the way back, I'm coming up to Sikeston, Illinois, or Sikeston, Missouri. Okay,
Okay.
which is where my great grandfather was working when he ended up getting to come to Fishers. So he sent his family on a train, and he took a buckboard wagon with all the family stuff and two mules and took it 480 miles from there to Fishers. So that was 1935, and I'm sitting
Okay.
there going, "That's a long way," and there wasn't really good highways at that time.
Yeah.
So it kind of gives you a little more perspective on, wow, that was
Yeah.
fairly significant.
So, and then, in this group, I mean, they operated well into the 1930s. So obviously, once the automobile came into being, um, they kind of changed their focus. So now, no longer did they go after horse thieves, but they did go after chicken thieves. They went after people that stole cars. So they still use their powers. But I think around in the 1930s, I think people started getting fed up with the Horse Thief Detective Association because they felt like they were police officers because they had police powers and they would do some things that, um, like when it came to voting, they felt like they could enforce voting laws or whatever. And then eventually the when the KKK, DC Stevenson, they were the horse thieves were linked to the KKK. Um, but I don't think that they were really linked to them. But it's the the appearance of association is what killed him. DC Stevenson, he wanted to form a chapter because he knew that they had police powers. That's what he wanted. So DC Stevenson wanted to create because there was a procedure. If you wanted to create a chapter, I think you only needed like 10 members. You pay your dues to the state, the Secretary of State, and you would get a chapter. So what DC Stevenson was trying to do was create a chapter so that his members, the KKK, would have police powers. And eventually the horse thief said, we're not associated with this with him. But once again, just
Once
the
you get branded,
just the association, and it was just kind of like that was the downhill for them. And then eventually, I don't have the exact year. I think it was 1933, which is when the Indiana State Police was formed. Um, the horse thief was officially disbanded by the state legislature, so they were no more. But when I was researching this, there's a guy in Huntington, Indiana, and I found him through an article that had been written about 4 or 5 years earlier. His number was still in the article. It was a very local article, so I
yeah.
called the number, and sure enough, he answered. And I went up to his house and met with him. He has a collection of all the badges from the Horse Thief Detective Associations. He has all of this memorabilia, and it's amazing what he has. And then, if you've ever been to Wabash University,
Yeah.
um, they have an entire section dedicated to the Horse Thief Detective Association. So they have an entire museum and library catalog. That's where I did a lot of my research, and that's all at Wabash. So
Yeah, that my son went there for a semester and then decided he didn't really like it. And I was glad because of the price. Uh,
yeah,
but uh, but it's like walking into a movie set. That campus is,
yeah.
what, all built in the 1800s. So
And then another group I'll tell you about is back during the time of Dillinger. Um, we had a big problem with Dillinger robbing banks, right? So now we're like, what do we do for this? And banks were getting, especially rural banks, were getting targeted, and we did not have a state police force at the time. And the Banking Association urged the state legislature, will you please get us a state police force? Because at the time, there was like maybe 4 or 5 states that had a state police force: New York, Pennsylvania. Um, and the reason why there was so much pushback for a state police force is they thought the governor would use it to silence the opponents. It was all political. That's
Right.
why it took us forever to get a state police force. But they said that we need a like Indianapolis they already had a police department. They were a big city, but a lot of these rural places they were sitting ducks. There was no law enforcement, and they needed a state police force to patrol these rural areas. And I think the state police bill got shot down at least two or three times.
Well, I mean, technically, it's the same complaint that our founding that whole generations and multiple generations had about a standing army.
Yes,
I mean,
yes,
it was the same fear.
yeah. And then also I found out that's why the South, a lot of your southern states, they didn't get a state police force well until like the 40s because they thought that the southern states would use the state police to intimidate black residents. So the southern states, it took a long time. If you look at when state polices were formed, they it took a long time for them to get a state police force. But 1933 is when they finally agreed on a to give us a state police. But until then, the banking association said, "All right, well, how about we put National Guard soldiers into the banks?" So they toyed with that idea about putting National Guard soldiers in banks to prevent these bank robbers from robbing them, and they realized that was too costly. So then there was a guy in Iowa who was the police chief of Des Moines. He came up with an idea, and he implemented it first in Iowa, and then it spread to like other states like Illinois, and then Indiana decided that we're going to go with this, and they're called banking vigilantes. And basically, all it is people like you or if I was not in law enforcement, we would just all gather together, and we are going to go after bank robbers. And the state legislature gave you police powers only during the times of a bank robbery. It did not apply to anything else. You couldn't use your police powers to go after, a thief or anything like that. But if a bank robbery occurred in town, an alarm would go out and you would go get your gear, get your car, and go after the bank robbers.
Kind of
And
like a volunteer fireman.
yeah, pretty much that's exactly what I would say it is. Um, they were so well organized that every year they would have all the banking vigilantes in Indiana would gather at Fort Benjamin Harrison and have a, a annual shoot off where they would practice marksmanship skills. Families could come out and be a cookout, and it was all of the banking vigilantes in the entire state. Um, but this is what we had to do until they finally formed a state police that could also patrol some of the rural areas. But once the like Dillinger and his gang, once they knew that you could target one of these banks, it's you could walk in there and just rob them and you're out, and there's no way the sheriff wouldn't be able to catch you. You already be across the county line by the time the sheriff even found out that you had robbed the bank.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but once again, this is a group. I mean, they even had women. There was a in my book. There's a picture, the front page of the Hoosier Banker. It was a magazine that the Banking Association sent out, and it was like four women, and they were holding their guns, and so anybody could be a banking vigilante back then. And it was also interesting that back then, bank robbery was not a federal crime at this point. That was the other key thing that people need to know is that it wasn't until FDR when he created the FDIC, banking bank robbery was still a state crime. So the federal government really didn't get involved. Now, if you rob a bank because the money's insured by the federal government, it automatically comes under the jurisdiction of the FBI.
Yeah. So now I wonder if I can just see those people that were the bank robber, group, all of a sudden taking a job working at the bank, sitting there in the lobby. Anyway, so but because eventually that's what happened. We still see that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and then if you think about it, like it was a big deal. They had to actually go and find that money because, like the bank got robbed, your money's still insured. But before the FDIC, if they robbed that safe, you were out that money. I think that's why a lot of people, especially people living in the depression, a lot of those people didn't trust banks
Hmm.
after that. And in Fishers, that we had our bank got robbed twice. That was on 116th Street, and the last time they got robbed, they couldn't recover from that, and the bank eventually closed up. But they sued the banker because people like I'm out of my money, and
Right.
they so it was imperative that they go out and try to recover as much money as they could because people were going to want their money back.
Right.
So
And the banker was on the hook for it.
yeah, and that's why a lot. If you look at some of the ads back then in the newspaper, if you're trying to find a bank, they talked about, we got the best safe, we got this alarm system. We come put your money in our bank because
Yeah.
we can protect it, and it
Right.
was a big deal back then. So
Instead of under the mattress or in a can in the yard.
yep. So and banking vigilantes, I mean they. I did come across one banking vigilante that died in the line of duty. And I actually had the opportunity to go meet with the sheriff. It's Vermilion County. So if you're not familiar with that, Vermilion County is on the border with Illinois, and the county seat's Clinton. But there was a bank robbery in Clinton, um, Indiana, and I'm not going to go into the whole story. You guys, read the book, but there's you could make a movie out of it. It was kind of comical in a way, because they chased these bank robbers. Banking vigilantes got in the car. They chased them. At one point, the suspect vehicle got a flat tire. They were exchanging gunfire, and they were changing the tire. They got the tire changed, and then they continued on again. Eventually, that car gave out. They stole a truck that belonged to a farmer. Didn't realize that this truck had a governor on it. It wouldn't go higher than 35 miles an hour. Eventually, had to abandon that. It was very comical, that part of it. Um, but there was a banking vigilante who answered the call. He went after the bank robbers. One of the gang members shot him and killed him, and then two of them committed suicide in over the state line in Illinois. But I went out and I met with the sheriff. They still have the sawed-off shotgun from that gunfight, and they have it in their property room. So they let me look at it, and then I rode around with the sheriff to some of the places where the shootout happened, like at the house. Um, but from my research, this is the only time that a banking vigilante actually died in the line of duty. And because he was technically a police officer, he is considered a police officer killed in the line of duty, because of he met the qualifications. He was a police officer performing. He was what they would call a special deputy today, but
Yeah.
he was a back then.
So, in your research on all this, now you come from a police officer background, or police, law enforcement, so you have maybe a different perspective than some people do on things. But what was the most disturbing group that you found in your research to you?
Um, I would say I'm going to say really just either the Whitecaps, or you also had another group called the Knights of the Golden Circle. And
I've heard of them, but I can't say why.
yeah, so the Knights of the Golden Circle, a lot of them were, well, when the Knights of the Golden Circle disbanded, a lot of them became Whitecaps. But they believed in slavery. There was a pro-slavery group, but what they envisioned was a slaveholding empire with its headquarters in Havana, Cuba, and I can't remember the distance, but a circle would from radiate from Havana that would uncover almost all of the southern United States, parts of South America, and almost all of the Caribbean. This entire circle would be um, slaveholding. So there was a lot of chapters, even in the North and Indiana, we had a chapter, even though we were fighting on the side of the Union. We had a chapter of the Knights of the Golden Circle, and what they became famous for was that they tried to assassinate Governor Morton,
Okay.
and then at the same time they tried to um, break out all of the Confederate POWs that were being housed at Camp.
Morton.
Yeah, Camp Morton. Yes, sorry, Camp Morton in Indianapolis. So they were eventually rounded up, and there was four of them that were because they were the leaders of the Indiana chapter. They were the one. They were these four were put on trial for the attempted assassination of Governor Morton, and then trying to break out the prisoners.
Well, Indiana had, both sides that were in here, on things. And um, I'm wondering if this was coinc I just learned about this recently and it freaked me out. I had no idea. I'd never heard this story before. But there was a group, it was the Democrat State Convention it was held in Indianapolis. And they were planning, and word got out. One of the Union soldiers had overheard this, or whatever, got word out. They were going to overthrow Morton, and they were going to go Confederate state with Indiana. Morton then sent the troops in to the convention, and the convention they all ran and got on trains, and I guess guns everywhere. They're dropping guns as they're trying to get onto the train to get out of
Oh
here,
wow.
and it happened over Pogues Creek.
Okay.
Okay, so I mean, I've lived here my whole life. I'm a history nerd, and I had never heard this until about 10 months ago, and I've done research on it since. But I
Yeah.
wonder if that was coinciding with that.
It could have been. Um, but I will say that the incident that happened here with that Landon Milligan. I don't know. Have you ever heard of him?
Who?
Landon Milligan.
Okay. I know
So
some Milligans, but
yeah, so he was one of the four conspirators that were tried. Um, they were all found guilty, and but his case went up to the Supreme Court, and now it actually set a precedent. We actually there's a state historical marker recognizing the Supreme Court case. So what happened was all four conspirators were found guilty, but at the time Lincoln had declared habeas corpus, and basically because we were in a state of war, um, they were going to be tried by a military tribunal. They were found guilty and sentenced to death. Well, Lambton Milligan appealed his case to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Lincoln's habeas corpus was not proper. And the reason for that was is that Indiana, we had not succeeded from the Union. We were still part of the Union, which means that our court system were still in operation. Down south, that's not the case. So because our court system was still in operation, these four conspirators should have been tried by a civilian court, not a military tribunal. And basically, what the Supreme Court said is it limited the power of the president to enact these type of things during wartime. And but yeah, it was a famous case. It's called Ex parte Milligan, and he won. And actually, the four co-conspirators they were released from prison.
wow.
Yeah, so they were not executed, but then they also, I mean, the amount of money that it costs for them to
Fight that over the
fight
Supreme
this
Court.
case, yeah, they basically died in basically poverty.
Yeah.
Uh, so, but yeah, that case actually, Lambton Milligan actually is a famous Supreme Court case that is discussed in law school, and Indiana is at the forefront of that because it all occurred here, and it wouldn't have occurred had it not been for the Knights of the Golden Circle. But I didn't
Yeah.
know anything about this group. This is one of those groups where, as I'm starting to research, I was like, Knights of the Golden Circle sounds like an interesting name. So then I started doing a little digging into that, and then this is where I found all this stuff.
Well, man, it's fascinating. I'm looking forward to reading the book. I haven't read that one yet, and now you got me on another one that I didn't know you had. So,
Which
you
one?
got one about all the
The Jennifer.
townships and stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah. That's
Hey,
it's a real good book. It's all broken down by townships. So not just it's so each township, yeah, each township has a bunch of different different stories, and we try to find things that nobody's written about before.
Yeah, that's very. My son's a trustee of a township, so he'll probably find that interesting too. So anyway, so yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing. How do people find this book?
So it's at Barnes and Noble. It's on Amazon. I mean, if you just did a Google search, you would find it. And this is kind of what the front cover of the
Yeah.
book looks like. So you can go, yeah, it's Target, any place where you can buy books, you would be able to find it there.
All right. Well, very good, man. Well, thank you so much for sharing with us.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I loved being able to talk about it.
All right, man. I'll talk to you later.
All right, take
Bye.
care. Thanks.